So another improvised patch tutorial. Once again, I will build a patch from scratch, concentrating on a specific module. Today we have the VCV Rescale. And again, I'm going to try and keep this as beginner friendly as I can. So let's start with what is Rescale anyway. So the most basic function of Rescale is to rescale signals, is to set a range of different signals. If you look, for example, at a scope here, and I will take an LFO, right? If we look at the original LFO, let's say the original LFO will be green, and then I will send it, let's say, with the blue cable through rescale, right? So the first thing we can do is, of course, we can rescale the amplitude or the gain of the LFO, right? All the way up by default. It will be not attenuated and not amplified, but I can attenuate this. You can see the blue signal is now attenuated. Maybe I can even do something like this, so we can see both of them, right? So you can see I can attenuate the signal. I can also invert it. I can invert the LFO, right? So instead of going up and down, it will go down and up. Right, so we can also invert it. We can also offset signals, so we can push them up and down. Instead of starting at 0, they will start right somewhere else, and this I can show you when I'm not offsetting it. Right, so now both LFOs start at the same, or both versions, let's say, start at the same place, but I can offset the blue signal, right, and push it up or down, right, and again change or rescale the range. And we also can set the maximum and minimum. So let's say I don't want this LFO to go above 2 volts, right? This LFO oscillates between -5 volts and +5 volts. I don't want it to go above +2, let's say, so I can set the maximum to 2. And now you see, whenever, if I disconnect the original LFO, whenever it goes to above to about 2 volts, which is here, let's say, let's make this a bit more precise, right? Something like this, right? The rescale will clip, right? It will limit the range of this LFO. So this is the most basic function, right? Basically setting the range of different signals, which is great. You can add more control to your patches with something like this. So let's start with a simple sequence, or just a sequence, let's say, with the sec3. The sec3 was our first video. Right, so let's do something like this. I will send the first row through rescale, right, and let's use a quantizer because I like to stay in a certain musical scale, right? So I will also quantize this. And then let's go just with a sine wave for now, right? So this will go to the pitch input of the VCO, and then let's just listen to the sine wave. Let's do something like this so it's not too loud. Right, let's set a higher tempo, and I will just set, right, more or less randomly the steps here. Right, so now what I can do is I can, for example, attenuate this signal, right? So it's not going up and down so much, right? With the gain control, I can also invert it if I want. So what goes up will go down and vice versa. I can also offset the pitch up and down. Right, so I can also offset the sequence. And again, I can also say I don't want this to go above, let's say, 1 volt, which is 1 octave, when we have 1 volt per octave. Right, so whenever it reaches, and you can see this here when the light is on, whenever it reaches 1 volt or more or less 1 volt, I have it set to 0.7. Right, it will just stay there, the signal will be clipped. And you know what, maybe I can also show you this on the scope here. Let's see if it fits. No, okay, like this. I just held control, by the way, and it pushed the modules to the left and to the right, right? If, for example, there is no space here for the scope, I hold control and then the modules will move. But I wanted to see this actually after rescale, so let's do this. Right, so you can see when it reaches here this limit, right, it will just stay there. If I remove this limit, right, it will go above it as well. Now pay attention, I added rescale before the quantizer. Again, the quantizer, maybe we'll have also a dedicated video about the quantizer, but the quantizer will correct incoming voltage. Right, it will correct it to musical intervals in this case. Now if I add rescale after the quantizer, so let's get rid of the scope for a second. Right, so the sequence will go to the quantizer, right, and again I will not make any changes for now. Right, and I want to attenuate this. I will attenuate this, but then we lose the quantization because the quantizer will correct the signal before rescale. Any changes we make after the quantizer will basically make the quantizer obsolete. Right, it will not correct anything after rescale. So if you want to use a quantizer, you don't have to, of course, but I recommend putting rescale and any other module basically before the quantizer. I think the last video or the first video we saw that we can put also a slew limiter after the quantizer, and also before that will create a different effect. But if you want to change a range of a sequence and then quantize it, it's better to do it before the quantizer. Right, so again now we can change, right, the most basic function here of the rescale is we can change or we can control the range of a signal if it's an LFO or if it's just like this, a sequence. Let's make this sequence a bit more interesting, something we did also in the first video. I can use the CV outputs here, the other rows, to control the tempo basically of the Sec3, right, so also feedback modulation, and create a bit more of an interesting sequence. So let's take this maybe 1 volt down, so it's half time. Right here maybe 2 volts down. And maybe this one a volt up. Right, just to make this a bit more interesting. And then what we can do is this. Let's use a sequential switch. This also we did this already in the first video, but just to add a bit of variation, I will use the 4-to-1 switch from VCV. We will have 1, 2, 3 copies of the first sequence. I just hold Control and Shift and I can get copy of cables. And then let's use the second here. The second row is a sort of a turnover or turnaround. I forgot how it's called, probably turnaround. Right, and the trigger for the sequential switch will come from the first output of the Sec3. Again, we did all of this already in the first video. If this is confusing, go back and watch the first video. We did everything there with the Sec3, but basically now we have 3 copies or 3 cycles of the first sequence and then 1 cycle of the second sequence that now we can change. Right, just so we have something a bit more interesting. Right, we can offset this a bit up maybe, or down. Right, so again, the most basic function of rescale is rescaling signals, and this can be all signals, LFOs, other modulation sources, random sources, sequences, and so on. You know what? Let's also rescale a random source. Okay, let's do something like this. Let's use a low-pass filter. Right, we will send a saw wave through a low-pass filter. Right, let's add also some delay. I promise that I will start using also other modules from other than VCV. So let's start using also the SurgeXT modules. For example, the delay from SurgeXT, just to have a bit more variation here. right, in the sound, just a bit more of an interesting sound. It's not such a complicated module. There are inputs, there are outputs, and you get a delay, basically. And now let's use a random module here. I will use the VCV random. Right, and again, if we look on the scope, we'll go with the linear output. Right, or the step output, doesn't matter. In this case, I'm going to stay with step modulation, and I'm going to clock it. We have a clock output here on the sec3. I'm going to clock it or trigger it with the sec3, right? So each step the sec3 advances, we will get a new random value, as you can see here. Now, by default, this random value goes from -5 to +5. Right, more or less, depends where it is. And I want to, again, rescale it. So first of all, I'm going to send this, maybe after the scope, I'm going to send this to the filter. Now, already here on the filter, I can attenuate and invert. Right, you saw this in the last video. With the attenuator, we can attenuate signals, in this case, the random source. Right, so I can decide how much the random source will affect the filter. Right, I can also invert it if I want, so instead of opening the filter, it will close it. But with rescale, again, I have more control. Let's see if I can find it quickly. Yeah. With rescale, I have more control because I can attenuate, invert, and offset also, and also set limitations. So I can say I don't want the random source to go above 3 volts, for example. Right, so this we can also do. So I'm going to send this to rescale. Now I'm going to open the attenuator all the way because I'm going to have control here from rescale. Right, so let's open this a bit. Right, and I can offset it, which actually in this case, the offset will be just like using the cutoff control. Right, I can set the starting point, right, where I want the filter to start or the cutoff to start, right, and then the random source will take it left or right. Right, so I can offset this. I have more control with rescale because I have also the maximum and minimum. So let's say I don't want this to go below whatever 1 volt, let's say, right, so I don't want it to close the filter too much. I want it just to more or less open the filter. Right, and again, maybe I will use a blue signal to see the result. So the blue signal is what's coming out of rescale. You can see it's a bit different. It doesn't go down so much. It doesn't go up so much because we attenuated it also a bit. The starting point is different because of the offset. Right, I'm going to add some reverb to this. And I will use Galaxy from Sapphire, which is quite a nice reverb. And because reverb is life, we need some reverb. Right. Right, maybe a bit more brightness. Right, so again, we have a nice sequence here. And now let's look at another way we can use rescale. And we saw it already with the minimum and maximum, the clipping, right? We can clip also signals, and this works really nicely also with audio, right? With actual voices. So also in the last video, I promised that I will use a different mixer. I will use a mixer from Venom, which is a VCA mix for stereo, which is very similar to the VCA mix from VCV. Right, but it's stereo. It has other features that I'm not going to look at in this video, but basically it's stereo, so we can mix also stereo signals. So I'm going to send this to the first channel, and then the mix here to the output. For now, I'm just going to take it down because I want to concentrate on the next voice with clipping. So let's create something a bit more complicated or a bit more interesting, let's say. Let's mix a few 3 VCOs, for example. And we can use the CV mix. Again, it's a CV mix, but it will also mix audio. So let's go with the triangle, let's go with the saw, and let's go with the sine, let's say. Okay, this again, I will send this into a filter and then a delay. Okay, I want to create a complex source, a complex audio source that then I can clip and I can distort with the rescale, right? So the mix will go to the filter. We will use again a low pass filter to the delay, and this for now will go to another channel. If you use here just a mono signal, it will duplicate itself. It will be, you can see this arrow here, internally routed also to the right input, so you don't have to worry about stereo or mono. Just connect it and it will work. Right, let's start with the first signal here. Let's create a chord, okay? So we have here, you know what, we can change this also. Let me mute this for a second, just so we are not always in C. Right, this is again the first sequence. Now, again, this will be a whole video by itself. But simply what we can do, we can tune the oscillator to a different note, and then instead of having, in this case, C minor because of the quantizer, we'll have a different note. Let's go with G. By default, most, if not all, oscillators in VCV Rack are tuned to C4. If I right-click the frequency and I enter the note G, now it will be tuned to G, so we have now a different scale. So again, I will remove this. And now let's try and create a chord here. So the first oscillator, let's say, will be also a G. Then the next oscillator, let's say, will be B flat. For entering flat, you just enter a small b, so it's going to be B, B. And let me bring this in. Right, and let's go with the D. Right, so we have already a chord. Right, with the filter, and now let's add some delay here with more feedback. Again, I want to create something a bit more complex. Right, and now before we add any movement to this, let's already use rescale. Right, and look at it also on the scope. Okay, so let's do this. The mix will go to rescale to the input. Right, so again, I can attenuate this. In this case, it will be level, volume. Right, maybe actually I will take it also up here a bit, so we can hear it a bit better, right? So I can attenuate the volume. You can see this also on the scope. Now in this case, offsetting it will not do a lot. It will just create DC offset, right? Something that we don't want. Again, this is a subject for a different video. But let's just bring the gain all the way up. Right, and now we can set limitations again, and this will clip the signal. So let's say that we don't want to go above 2 volts. Maybe I can zoom in a bit, maybe we can see this better. Maybe something like this. Right, if I take the maximum down, already you can start hearing this. We have distortion. I can take also the minimum down. Right? And we clip the signal. Now there is something else we can do. Right? If I bring this again to 0, let's say that I don't want to compromise the level. I want to distort it or to clip it, but I want it still to stay in the same loudness. So what we can do in the right-click menu, instead of, we can set the gain multiplication instead of 1, so it will just be what you put in, what you get out. We can make it, for example, 10 times. Right, so now the gain will go from 0 to 10. Right, so we can make it really loud, and then take the maximum to, let's say, about 5 volts, and the minimum to about 5 volts. Right, something like this. And then when I take the gain up, indeed, we can start distorting. We can start distorting and clipping basically the signal, right? Now Now here there's another thing that we can do, and you know what, I will save this for the next voice. Let's just start with something like this. Right, and again, also here I'm going to add reverb, and I'm going to use a different reverb. I'm going to use plateau. I'm going to use plateau here in this case. Right, and add more modulation that will modulate the pitch of the reflections, basically creating something a bit more detuned. Maybe a bit more feedback. Let's see how this sounds like with the first voice. So we have something a bit more crunchy. And now let's bring this with an envelope. So I will add an envelope before the filter here. Right, and what we can do, we can use, for example, this output here, this gate output from the sequencer to gate the envelope that will open the filter. But I would like it to sort of fade in so we can change the attack to be a bit longer. Right, something like this. Right, I can bring the cutoff a bit up here. Right, now again, this happens a bit too often, but first of all, what I would like to do is I would like this voice to be most of the time off, so I can take the drive down and use the same envelope to bring it also in, the level, the actual level in. Right, and also here you can see the envelope. Well, the time here is a bit weird. Okay, now it's better. Shorter attack. Right, now it happens a bit too often, so again what we can do is we can use a clock divider, for example. Right, a clock divider, for example, to make this happen less often. I don't want every cycle to trigger this chord. Right, so this same gate will go to a clock divider, and let's go, for example, with divided by 2. Right, so every 2 cycles it will happen. Right, and then because the gate is longer, I can have also a longer attack. Again, this is subject for a different video. Maybe a bit less here. I just don't want this to be so bright all the time. And we still get the crunch from the clipping. Right, maybe divided by 4 even, because it's a bit too often here. And maybe more feedback. So it's decaying, or feedback on the delay, so it's decaying a bit slower. Right, something like this. Now again, I will take the levels for a second down here so we can concentrate on another voice. And I want to show you another thing here with Rescale. Okay. That is also has something to do with the clipping. So let's see, let me bring in a scope and again an LFO. Okay, so now, again, I'm going to send an LFO through this. I'm going to set the gain all the way up. Just like we've seen before, we can also add more gain by changing the gain multiplier. So if I go to times 10, right, we can change the gain. And then again, the maximum and minimum we can bring back to 5 volts. And -5, so we have basically the same LFO, but with clipping, right? When it reaches the limits of 5 and -5, it will clip. In the right-click menu, we can choose also to reflect only at maximum, only at minimum, or both of them. And this will basically, instead of clipping the signal, it will invert it and it will go back into itself, basically acting as a wave folder. Right, so I'm going to do this for both of them. If I hold Control, I can select things in the menu and the menu will not close. So I can select both of them, right, and then bring back the gain and see what happens when it reaches 5 volts. Instead of clipping, we get wave folding. The wave folds back into itself, right, and we can create interesting modulation sources and also interesting sounds. So for example, if we use here not an LFO, but let's use a VCO, although as we've seen in the last video, an LFO is an oscillator like any other oscillator. We can use, right, a triangle wave, let's say, right, and instead of clipping, now we get wave folding. So the wave will fold back into itself. Let's see if we can create a nice bass drone with this. Okay, so let's see. Let's use 2 VCOs and again mix them with a CV mix. Let's say, let's mix a sine wave and a triangle wave. And this will go again to rescale. For now, let's not use a filter because we have wave folding. Let's see. This will be the first one. Again, we have G here, so I'm going to enter G1, let's say. This will be the lower note, and then G2. So we have an octave above. Right, again, let me show you this on the scope. I don't know why I keep deleting it. Right. You can start getting a really nice sound here for a bass. Let's mix it in. I like this sound. Right, so we can also add wave folding, and actually, and I'm going to show you this in a second, this is what I want to show you before. Right, we have a setting, the range of signals, clipping we have, folding we have. Now I want to show you how to add movement to this, sort of like PWM-like movement. But before we do this, I'm going to add a chorus to this with 2 delays, 2 VCV delays. A chorus is basically a delay with some movement, but a short delay. So more normally it's less than 40 milliseconds. Right, so let's do something like this here. Right, and we have a stereo. We will have a stereo signal. That's why I'm using 2 delays. Right, a copy of the signal will go to the second delay with Control and Shift. In this case, I just want the processed signal. Or you know what? No, let's mix it in. Let's use the mix output. I'm going to turn this off for a second. I just want to listen to this bass. Right, and let's bring the mix in. More feedback. And now what we need, we can use an LFO. Right, it will modulate the time slightly here to the right, or open the attenuator to the right. And then the second one, we will open the attenuator to the left, so they are opposite from one another. Make it slower. Change the tone a bit so we don't get the lower frequencies of the bass here. Right, and open the attenuator a bit more. I'm holding Control so I can open the attenuator just slightly, and again they should be in opposite directions. Right, this is without, and this is with Control Ease for bypassing modules. Right, so we have already here some movement, and now how we can add movement here. How we can add also movement here to the folding, right? We have no CV input. So what we can do, if I open this, for example, somewhere here, right? And as we've seen before, we can offset the signal up and down, but now when we offset it, it will be limited to the minimum and maximum values we set. So when I offset it, right, we get movement here. We can add a bit more. Right, it resembles a bit pulse width modulation. Again, this is a subject for a different video, but this is adding movement to the wave itself. Now, how we can do this? Also here we don't have CV input. Very simply, all we have to do is mix an LFO here with the signals, and the LFO will become an offset signal. It will offset the VCOs up and down because we mix it in, right? We mix in the voltage, everything is voltage. LFOs are voltage, VCOs are also voltage. And you know what, maybe I can show you this on a separate scope. Right, LFO, VCO, and a mixer. Right, so this will be the VCO here on the scope. Right, and now when I'm mixing an LFO, it will push this VCO up and down. Let me zoom in a bit. Right? It adds offset to the signal. It goes up and down, which means that now I can add offset with an LFO here when I mix it in with the oscillators. Right, a bit slower. And we have movement. Again, it will offset the oscillators, but because we have limits, it will not go above and below. Instead, it will fold the wave back into itself. Right, so let's mix in again the bass here. So again, we can create wave folding also with rescale. Again, rescaling signals, setting their range, their polarity with the offset. You can clip signals if it's modulation, sequencing if it's audio rate signals, and if you activate the folding in the right-click menu, reflect, you can also do this just at the maximum or just at the minimum. Right, you have also a wave folder. Right, and that's more or less what I want to show you today. It's a bit shorter than usual, but I hope you will go and experiment with Rescale a bit more. It might look like a simple module, but you can see you can do so many things with it. Try and add this to your sound design tools, right? Try wave folding with it. Also try and wave fold modulation. As we've seen before, this we can wave fold also LFOs, and then you get unique LFO shapes. And that was it. Again, thank you again so much for watching. Cheers.